Caroline is a recent graduate within women and gender studies, having just finished their master's degree with a thesis specializing in bisexual literature and experiences that they will be presenting today. They have a background uh, uh, in political science and have previously presented work on the image of the female dominatrix as a form of feminist empowerment. So, Caroline, the floor is yours for the next 15 minutes. Thank you for being here, and we're really excited for your presentation. Go ahead.
Of course, thank you so much. For screen sharing, it's saying that the host has disabled attendee screen sharing.
All right, I'm going to change that right now. You should be good to go now, hopefully.
Okay, absolutely perfect. Let me just do this. Oh, okay, let me do that again. All right, can everyone see that okay?
Yes, it's all good on my end, so.
Okay, so my presentation is on the bisexual culture. Bisexual culture. It's an analysis of bisexual literature, reflecting the plurality of bisexual lives. So when I first started this research, it basically got inspired from me going into a queer independent bookshop in the UK, and there being about 7 bisexual books on the shelf, and that was mainly all 4 hardstoppers that were out at the time. So it was very, very underrepresented, and it made me think, is bisexuality really underrepresented in literature, or is it just a matter of market? And that's sort of where I came to. And this was basically the foundation of my master's thesis, which I just completed. So to do this research, I basically selected 4 YA novels in order to sort of establish how bisexuality is represented to a younger audience and how it can be presented to people through who sort of have, like, I want to say probably a little bit more lack of life experience compared to some more older queer people. So I firstly started doing obviously the Heartstopper, because in the UK and especially across Europe and the US, it's obviously a massive, massive book. The series got really, really big popularity. I also did One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. Obviously, Casey McQuiston has other works such as Red, White and Royal Blue, which it's obviously Amazon Prime film. And they've done other works. Obviously, The Pairing's just been released, which also contains bisexual characters. I also did 2 books which are a lot more unknown, which is Fraternity by Andy Mientus, and I did Ramona Blue by Julie Murphy. And Julie Murphy's book is one of the oldest, so it's about 2017, so I feel a bit weird calling it the oldest, but it's one of the older books that I basically chose to study on. So I chose to focus on 4 very different genre of stories, because essentially viewing the different genre stories allowed me to see sort of like the different ways in which bisexuality can be seen in everyday sort of life. I know one of them is an occult story, so it's not exactly based in everyday life, but it presented sort of the way that bisexuality can be seen across different representations, across different environments, and sort of see where it goes from there. Like I say, there's massively different popularities between the book, with Heartstopper and One Last Stop being a lot more popular compared to the other 2. This is just measured through Goodreads reviews, Goodreads awards, and Book Talk, because obviously this is YA literature, and I was looking at sort of like what YA audiences can understand, and they came as the most popular, whereas Fraternity and Ramona Blue had less than 100 hashtags each on Book Talk, and I had absolutely very little on Goodreads. And all of the authors were queer, and 3 out of 4 of them did identify as bisexual, with the exception of Alice Oseman, who identifies as asexual and aromantic. And I really wanted to focus on having queer authors, because I felt having queer authors provides a more authentic sort of representation and a more developed understanding of bisexuality, or at least queer sexuality in general. So for my methodology, I'll just make this one quick because it's not that big in this. I basically chose to queer the idea focus groups, and I created a bisexual book club called the Bisexual Disasters. And this basically created a bisexual community. I based it on Zoom because then it meant there was no limitation to who could join, and it meant there was no limitation for accessibility in terms of live captioning, in terms of doing trigger warnings and content warnings. It just allowed people to attend and have that freedom of leaving whenever they could, without having to sort of like awkwardly stand up from a table and excuse themselves. It meant people could come and go as freely as I could make possible. And I aimed for a demographic between 18 to 30, which I did end up sort of being fixed within. I aimed for it being a very mixed gender. However, there was 2 queer gendered people, myself included. However, there was very, very little male representative throughout the entire book club, which that in itself could be its own research, but that is absolutely fine. So when I say queer in focus groups, basically what I mean by this is I set up no time limits to the focus group. I didn't set up any restrictions or rules to it, aside from just be nice to each other and just raise your hand when you want to speak. I allowed sort of people to engage freely within the book club, if engage freely on Instagram, which is where I mainly advertised it. And I allowed sort of like discussions with myself as a researcher and to put myself in the same position as they would be as just a book club attendant. So I basically limited any pre-thought out questions. I limited any pre-thought out themes because the entire point of this was to see sort of how varied bisexuality can be across the country and across sort of like academia in general, essentially. So the first of my 3 themes that I found across this work, which has spanned over about 4 months, was bi literature as a form of belonging. And when I say belonging, it wasn't just belonging as in the sense of sort of like, where do bisexuals belong in a space? Is there a space for bisexuality within queer spaces? Or because bisexuality being a non-binary sexuality, does it sort of find it difficult to navigate these more sort of binary spaces? And yeah, and I also did the form of longing for sort of people desiring to be within spaces that are catered for them. So obviously in the discussions that we had, there was always discussions of like the GSA, which is like a gay straight alliance, or sort of like dyke marches, whereas there was kind of a critical lack of bisexual spaces or spaces where bisexuals felt comfortable in because they were either so generalized, it was too big of a group, or it was so specifically focused on binaries that it made people not be able to fit into them. So the first thing that came up was bisexual literature as a form of escapism. And basically participants said that they don't read because for stress, they read for escapism, and they want to find joy in bisexual literature that they can find. And another participant, when we were discussing rurality within bisexual literature and just bisexual lives in general, one of my participants was from very rural Scotland, so she didn't have very sort of great accessibility to queer spaces, and so literature provided that form of outlet to experience a way of living of bisexuality and a way of living of different lifestyles. And from that it came this idea of, can bisexuality offer, or bisexual literature offer, the opportunity to experience multiple different lives through just reading alone? So from that, I move on to the idea of literature as a space itself. So for this, I basically developed upon Ansel Adai's idea of the borderlands and sort of bisexuality being a borderland, which is what Callis argued in 2014, and suggested the idea of, can literature serve as a space itself, an intangible space where you can't exist in anything but in sort of in theory. And basically it found that a lot of participants did completely agree that literature served as a space where they could explore and they could be free to be themselves. However, it just did not translate across to a physical world, which is one of the biggest shames about this. But obviously with the book club, it gave an opportunity to have a space of belonging. And it's still going on now, even post-research, which is really, really great. So we've managed to create a community where I didn't think a community could be created. So, and then finally, discuss sort of the idea of bisexual literature as a form of history. So we discussed the idea of books not needing to traumatize the audience to accurately represent sort of like queer history. So in books such as Fraternity and One Last Stop, they both discuss sort of queer history. However, Fraternity discussed the AIDS crisis very, very directly, and in a way where no person reading it could feel upset at the representations or be misrepresented of how bisexuality was understood at the time. Obviously, bisexuals were understood as like secret transmit carriers, and bisexual men were double agents, and they could basically harm hetero women, and that was the biggest catastrophe that could come out of the AIDS crisis. And basically Fraternity did an excellent way of navigating this difficult sort of dichotomy of how do you manage sort of two sides of yourself in such a time as the AIDS crisis. And basically what was understood from that is a lot of like younger audiences now, because quite a few of my participants were teachers or worked with youth clubs, they found that a lot of young adults actually already knew their queer history. But this isn't because of formal school teaching, it was because of informal knowledge that they obtained from young adult literature. So the works of One Last Stop and the works of Fraternity actually did a really good job at presenting history and bisexual history in a way of making it easy to understand, but also not traumatic to go through, which was absolutely incredible to read. Another thing that I found was bisexual literature as an affirmation. And basically with bisexual literature as an affirmation, it was the idea of having this literature available and people being affirmed in their identity from it. So being able to read sort of your experiences, your joys, maybe your traumas, and having that, being able to relate to it allowed people to really sort of feel comfortable in their identity. So one of my participants, when we read Heartstopper, obviously it was the first book, they had said, I should have read this book prior to some point in my life. And the participant was about 29 and had recently in the past few years came out as bisexual. And she was very much like, this book categorically could save me so much sort of crisis moments in understanding my bisexuality because of the way that it navigated how obviously Nick in the character understood his bisexuality. And we've seen Am I Gay quizzes on the screens, which is always one of the things that I was reflected on from my own teenage years. And another participant basically recognised a massive change in the media over the past 20 years, from Willow in Buffy the Vampire Slayer being she described it as being forced to be a lesbian character rather than going through a bisexual journey, versus to now Nick Nelson being this overtly masculine character, being able to visibly go through a bisexual journey and understand that, and the audience can understand that as well. And seeing bisexual discovery on stage really created an affirmation for some people. Then in the centre here, we have a definition from Andy Mientus's book Fraternity. And this is the only definition that was actually defined in all 4 of the novels for bisexuality. And essentially this definition led to a lot of affirmations, but not because people who were reading it who are bisexual felt affirmed by it. They could share with their peers, and their peers could finally understand what it felt for them to be bisexual, and that created a source of affirmation for them, and that was really changing for them. So a lot of people read it and was like, and shared it to their friends and was like, this is exactly how I feel. And they were very sort of then open-minded to being like, okay, that's what you go through. Because obviously if you're in a binary understanding of sexuality and you've never had to navigate a change in how you perceive yourself, it can be one of those things where people just simply don't understand what sort of transition you can go through with it. So having one definition be so explicitly stated out like that really provided an affirming sort of like an affirming definition for people to go through. However, with the literature, not all of the literature is written equally, and there is racism within the literature that has not been navigated well. So in one book, which is Ramona Blue, obviously it was 2017, it's one of the oldest books, one of the side characters is a Black character called Freddie, and there's numerous racial microaggressions against him. However, these do not add to the plot, these do not further any character development, they are simply in there. And one of my participants said, I'd rather you not write a Black character than I would write a Black character and just use racist language, because it doesn't save anything, and all it did was re-traumatize an audience. And then from that came the idea of all the books did not actually have, they were all very white passing protagonists. So the main character for Fraternity was white passing, although he was half Korean. But people did not recognize him as half Korean, they only seen him as white character. So for that, I kind of included it as inclusive, because there was no representation for actually racially diverse bisexuals in the literature, which is a massive shame. And I did not realize it until after I completed the research. But with that comes the development of, there's a lack of ethnically diverse media that was shown in the research. And then one of my participants essentially recalled her experience of being in Black dominated spaces and how she has never read as queer because there's no demonstration for what a Black bisexual looks like, at least in this literature. So it meant for her, when she's in a very ethnically diverse space, nobody reads her as queer. She's not recognised as that. But when she's in a queer space, she automatically feels included, but then she's singled out because of her ethnicity. So it led to this sort of like divide of choosing what path you need to go down, whether you affirm your race or whether you affirm your sexuality. And that is something I would like to further research, but that is one thing that we did find as a research group. is the fact that there was a lot of divides, if not for sexuality, because of the relationship that sexuality has with everybody else's sort of interactions with the real world. And then finally, we found that bisexual literature, for all it has its limitations, does have a lot of potential. So in it, the literature itself challenged a lot of stereotypes. So 3 out of 4 of the protagonists within the literature didn't have their bisexuality assumed because of their hair, clothing, or physical appearance, which in day-to-day life the participants regarded. They've always had their bisexuality assumed. One of my participants even said, I've always had hair that's brightly coloured. And when I came out, my friend said, oh, of course we know you're bisexual because of your hair. And for that led to her to have sort of a de-affirmation of bisexuality, because it kind of took away her autonomy to being able to own that coming out and own that confession. So to have characters where they are so normative looking, it basically reaffirmed the idea that bisexuality is not intrinsically something so non-normative it can't blend in with an everyday society. And a lot of the characters actually abided by gender norms and sort of how you would expect a person of that affirmed gender to look, like Nick Nelson, overtly masculine rugby player, August in One Last Stop, overtly feminine, long flowing hair, wears makeup. And then Ramona Blue is a very just wears dresses, wears big dock boots. And even in that, she progresses from having bright blue coloured hair as a lesbian, realizes her bisexuality, and then her hair turns into a normative colour and she dresses a normative person. So even through that, you can see that bisexuality is in fact can be seen as a normative identity, and it doesn't abide by the binary understandings of some queer sexualities, i.e. sort of like masc lesbians or sort of feminine gay men. There isn't that sort of limitations with bisexuality, and that was really important to see. With the challenge and the stereotypes as well, it moves on to the idea that literature, with it being a part of popular culture, can massively change societal understandings of how we understand bisexuality. However, with that, the participants in the bisexual group knew that bisexuality was limitless and knew that bisexuality was not restrained to these sort of binary ideas of gender. However, it's in fact people sort of outside of this group that need to understand that bisexuality is not sort of one image and one understanding. So it kind of questioned, where do the stereotypes come from, as it's not in bisexual literature, so where are we emerging them from? And then finally, I came up with this idea of hetero potential, and this came from the idea of some of my participants having to navigate the idea of being in a hetero relationship or hetero appearing relationship, but also having to navigate queer spaces and navigate their queer relationships with their friends. So I remember one participant said sort of like, if I'm in a queer space I go to, how do I tell them I've started dating this guy? Because she's always been read as sort of like such a queer sort of lesbian, bisexual, but people only recognize her through her queerness and her attraction to the same gender. And it was navigating the idea that sort of like bisexuals do in fact still date people of the opposite gender, and that it's not intrinsically it is intrinsically a queer identity, but it's not intrinsically limited to dating people of the same gender. And then with that, we moved on to the idea from Hemmings of the bisexual confession, in that bisexuals have to admit at some point that they are bisexual. Otherwise, if they can navigate a relationship with, say, if as a woman you would navigate a relationship with another woman, and some people do not want to date a bisexual, and that is unfortunately a thing of the dating scene. So there's always this idea of a bisexual confession, because you need to own it. Otherwise, you portray an idea, or it can be suggested you portray an idea that people have of you when it's not that. And it basically emerged of hetero potential, of the idea of bisexuals are more than their queerness. They are, in fact, they navigate these straight spaces as well as queer spaces. So to conclude, so for bisexual plurality, it was found that there's multiple demonstrations of individuals seeing their experiences documented on paper. Even though there was racism within some of the literature that did not favour the characters, there was also racial characters, racial side characters, should I say, did still have their affirming happy ending, which is not documented in a lot of literature. One of my participants even said it was so refreshing to see a Black character having a happy ending. And basically we went further to say that bisexuality, seeing it on literature, basically affirmed a troubling identity for participants, and it afforded them more security in themselves. And then with bisexual literature being able to defeat stereotypes, and it promoted a positive image of bisexuality. I say positive in quotation marks because a positive image can massively depend on what you understand as positive. But for this, under my guise of a positive, it promoted a limitless idea of bisexuality. And then the knowledges that we can learn from this is the fact that younger audience can learn history through such informal methods, where UK schooling especially, it's not there. There's no queer history within schooling. Same in the US with book bans. We need informal, accessible historical knowledge that can be obtained through fiction or non-fiction, so every person can read it and understand what's going through without having to suffer any traumatic relationship with it. So the literature also allows us to navigate conversation on intimate relationships and first times. And it also goes through the idea that bisexuality can appear in massive variations of way. There's no one way to look bisexual. And then finally informs the audience that their bisexuality identity is not solely focused on their relationship status. You can be bisexual single, you can be bisexual with a man or a woman or with a non-binary person or with any person of any gender. There's no limitation to bisexuality. So then finally, as I've recalled the positives, I'll also recall one of the negatives, which is literature and the bisexual potential. And that's essentially literature can still greatly grow. And this was the overall conclusion, is literature is as limitless as bisexuality is, because it will always constantly change and it will constantly revolutionize itself. So there has to be greater discussion on race and ethnicity's relationship with sexuality, and there needs to be an acknowledgement of sometimes they don't always mesh together. History can be taught through fictional analogies, allowing the audience to gain knowledge without having to suffer through sort of having to read academic journals. You can read it in a casual way. And then finally, bisexual literature needs to be able to show the idea that accepting a label, not accepting your feelings, but accepting the label and the politics that comes with accepting the label of bisexuality, can be difficult, and it's not always easy. And literature needs to show sometimes, although there's joy, there can also be limits to understanding yourself. And that's unfortunately just one of the things of being queer. And that is it. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for that fantastic presentation and for starting us off on a really, really strong foot. We'll save questions for them at the end of the panel, and then we'll, do everything all at once. Just as a side note, because I totally forgot to mention this when we started the room, but just for the sake of keeping on track with time, like I'll send personal DMs to the speakers if like at the 5-minute mark, at the 2-minute mark, and at the 1-minute mark, just to make sure. I mean, obviously we have a bit of extra time since we're missing a presenter, but just in case. So you can go for by like a couple of minutes, but I'll still give the time warnings just in case. Okay, so we'll move on to our second presentation by Camille Valerio Riste, who is currently a PhD candidate for the Department of Modern Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, specifically in Japanese literature, at the University of Bologna. His research focuses on representations and queerness in the native Japanese context, using comics and animation as the main reference point to aid his study. So let's all welcome Camille, and the floor is yours. You should be a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I was checking. Okay, so now you should tell me if you can see the presentation. Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for having me here. This is the first time that I'm joining this conference, and as you have already said, I focused my research project focuses on queer representations in Japanese pop media, specifically comics and animation. So today we are going to see Japan as a case study. Let me see. There you go. One thing that we have to keep in mind is that bisexualities in Japan are not studied specifically, so there is a lack of academic research specifically on bi plus people and queer identities related to bisexualities and pansexuality, etc. But an increasingly bigger number of people are identifying with the term following a really recent, like just last year, review of 6,000 people, 6,000 people, out of whom 2.8% identified as bisexual. So the growing, there is a growing part of queer people in Japan that identify with the label of bisexual. As I say, this identity politics is not really appreciated in Japanese society, because identifying oneself as something that is out of the norm might specify a facet of yourself that is actually stepping out of what's been laid out for everyone. So people are more reluctant to labeling oneself. As the Japanese society is very role-based, so a woman has to be a mother, has to be a wife, has to be heterosexual, etc. So this is just an example. Bisexualities are not, I mean, actively persecuted, but since you have this pressure of actually filling a role in a heterosexual, monogamous, and standardized, relationship or marriage, coming out is often avoided, especially because coming out is not always considered the most liberating choice, nor the safest, especially in a workplace situation when coming out could jeopardize your chances to move on with your career, or actually being demoted or actively ostracized in certain situations. So also depending on where your work takes place, for example, in schools or in a in a like sorry in okay, moving on, the word just escaped my mind, sorry. And the English is not my first language, so sometimes I just miss words. But moving on to visual and narrative tropes in Japanese comics and animation, we have to wonder, what do we consider as bisexual in a character? Like, are they someone who has sex with people of other genders, or are they someone who is attracted to different genders? This is a very different use of the word, and we always have to keep in mind that bisexual, much like pansexual, etc., are imported word in the Japanese context. So what do they mean to Japanese natives? They have their own version of bisexuality as a term, but they also use bisexuality as a term. So it's literally just taken from another context and applied to their own. So in Japanese media, we can find characters that are shown to have sexual intercourses with various genders. However, these comes without explicitly stating their sexual or romantic attraction in the story. So I took the example of this character from Berserk, which is a very popular fantasy manga by Miura Kentaro and Mori Koji. And the character is called Griffiths, and he uses sex throughout the story to push forward his own goals. So it's not linked specifically to his own sexualities or what he feels, but is a facet of the plot. So we can't fully apply the label of bisexual to a characters to such characters, since they serve a narrative function. Also, Japanese comics and animation have a link with theater, and with theater, I mean everyone has the kind of like the example of Greek theater with masks that were easily recognizable, telling everyone who the characters on the stage were representing. So in this case, we also have the same aesthetic codes in Japanese comics and animation. So that's a specific aesthetic facets or specific behaviors are immediately are used to make the audience immediately perceive and understand the character or the narrative purpose that the character has. This has been growing and got more standardized since the late 1980s because of the consumeristic approach. So these helped audiences understand characters better. So this is why we can see a standardized set of characters in many comics, in many manga or animation, even to this day. So they are specific. They are specific to the Japanese context and their visual frame of reference. So what do we consider as bisexuality in these characters? because in most of the times what we can see in Japanese bisexual, so to speak, characters is that they are often linked to surprise or deviancy, but also disruption of norms. So this can have a positive or negative twist to the narrative. So it is not always used as the receptacle for stigmatization, but it can underline the peculiarity of the character. So this character is in love or has sex or is ambiguous towards many genders, and they are out of the norm. So this can also be seen as a positive. And we have to always keep in mind that identity, the labels are not particularly used as we are more, often, as we often see in European or North American use of the LGBTQI plus language. So a lack of labels shouldn't be seen as a lack of representation, because Japanese media rely a lot on the viewer or reader's interpretation of what they see. So characters are hinted as being interested in a variety of genders, but it is mostly presented as a discrepancy from the norm or a plot point. So it shows some characters, for example, Ramma from Ramen oneself by Takahashi Rumiko, in which the main characters turns from male to female by touching hot water. So since the protagonist is interested in a girl, his neighbor, what does bisexuality mean in this case when he turns into a girl? So how is it how can we describe that as bisexuality? Or another example is Tenjo Utena from Utena by the Papas group from 1997, in which the main protagonist shows interest in both male and female characters, although she never states to be actively interested in both of them. They just happen to be interested in both male and female characters. Another character that I picked was from Caricature Sakura by Clamp, in which the character on the left of the last image, I don't know if you can see my cursor, shows interest in the flowery boy in the middle. Because of a plot point, since there is some magic involved, so there is magical infatuation. But the same character also shows affection and later romantic feelings for the main character, who is a girl. So we can see bisexuality used as a plot point, but it's not negative by any means. Of course, we have negative stereotypes too, as we can find bisexuality actually linked to obsessive behavior, fondness for extreme or peculiar sexual practices, mental instability, or manipulation that are linked to certain villainous characters or show their unreliability. So some examples that I used were Diobrando from the popular manga JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, in which his actual bisexuality is stated textually and is a facet of his link to being a villain, because it's more seen as sexually free than actual bisexuality. So out of the norm, so to speak. The other characters is Toga Himiko from My Hero Academia. And their character is actually more linked to the Japanese stereotype, Japanese aesthetic or visual character of the yandere girl. Who the yandere girl means that it's a character, a female character usually, who loves who is obsessed with their love interest and gets violent with the anyone that tries to get near their love interest. So it doesn't really link specifically with bisexuality, but in this case, since she is interested in both the protagonist and who is a male character and a female character, which is also a part of the main roster of the protagonist, that can be seen as a negative link, so bisexuality linked to an extreme behavior. Of course, bi+ stories are also shown without this need for visual and narrative codes. So as the example of Blue Flag, in which the protagonist, the character in the middle of the lower left image, is has romantic feelings for both these two other classmates, or Wandering Song by Shimura Takako, who shows the fluidity of sexuality following a roster of young characters from middle school to university, and they have constant changing in how they perceive their own sexuality and their own gender. So concluding, I would say that we cannot generalize Japanese media as a monolith of lack of or bad representation if we use the Euro-North American point of view, because I've seen a lot of people going really almost enjoying going against the Japanese media for the lack of, so to say, lack of representation, without understanding the context these representations or these works move themselves. And Japanese works do involve queer, ambiguous, or bi+ characters and relationship, of course, and they don't fall in the same cultural or narrative framework that we are used to, I would say. So bi+ characters exist in a setting where the audience has no explicit answer on how to interpret them. And then I think pose a lot of Western scholars to, I would say, create this generalization of Japanese media. This is all. Thank you so much for listening to the presentation. I hope it was interesting, and these are some of the references that I used. I hope I was in time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Camille. And yes, your time was great. So thank you. And that was super, super interesting. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions at the end of the session. Okay, so it seems we're moving on to our last presentation of the day, or for this panel, sorry, not for the day. And we're going to be hearing from Alice Rugai. So Alice is an Italian writer based in Germany, with a Bachelor in Foreign Languages and Literature from Pisa, and MA in Theaterwissenschaft at the Freie University in Berlin, who is right now writing in German, English, and Italian at the University of the Arts in Berlin in the Faculty of Writing for the Scene. Alice is also a publisher for Fischer Theater und Medien. Alice's work focuses on bi-visibility, biodiversity, and working class empowerment. So please welcome Alice, and you can take the floor and present whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm sorry for the German words that were very difficult in my bio. I'm gonna do screen sharing, and I hope it works. Can you see the presentation?
Yeah, all good on my end.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So my name is Alice, and I'm a writer. I'm not a researcher, so I'm very bad at summarizing. I hope it works in 10 minutes. The title is Between Parasocial Activism and Pedagogy, Intersectional Perspective in Presenting B+ Characters in Theater for a Young Public in Germany. So I'm gonna present the story of the Amsterwheel, in German Amsterrad. That's a play that I've written during a cooperation with a Theater for Young Publics. It's a theater that's specialized for teenage stories, Theaterstrahl, in Berlin, and my university where I study drama. Cool. So here's the link. You cannot click it, but I can put it in the chat afterwards. So I'm 31 and I grew up without B+ characters. So especially without good representation and without underage representation. So I wanted to create the thing that I never had. So I've used the Amster as a metaphor both for class and for bisexuality. Class because being in the Amsterwheel is a sort of like working class metaphor, and I don't know if this is a cultural thing, but in Germany they say very often to be in the Amsterwheel, to be in the Amsterrad. So it's playing with words. And the part of the bisexuality for me was because they play in the play, they play with the question, are you a cat or a dog person? And the main character is like, oh, I don't know, I'm an hamster person. So the main character is Cree, the one with the hat here, and is a bisexual and bi, although the gender is not explicitly mentioned, and I managed not to use any pronouns during the script. So I'm going to use now the pronoun there because I had to translate just with English, but in the play you wouldn't hear any pronoun. So Cree as their first period, their first queer love, and their first hamster. And this coming of age is considered for people up to 13 years old. I will focus on some questions that I had to answer to myself to create a good cultural product, and which may be interesting for those who would like to try to do the same. After giving tools on how to do parasocial activism with theater, I'm going to talk about the dark side. So changing a narrative is very rewarding, but also extremely challenging on a structural and on a personal level. So here are some of the questions. Let's start with, which is the best way to present pedagogically a B+ minor in order to empower the B+ public, but without excluding the monosexual audience? So what are you writing for? So let's start from the term parasocial activism of the title. I know it sounds quite like the social version of activism, and in fact, it is a sort of nerdy, friendly activism. And I mean, I could have used the word, the term representation, but I wanted to sound more mysterious. So parasocial relationships are the one very short summarized that we create with fictional characters, but also with very important people or influencers but people that we don't know personally. So parasocial relationship, there's a theory about it that shows that they can help us overcome certain types of stereotypes, and they work much better in the long term. So if it is a series, it's better, but also for theater that they can actually work. So the idea is that they can help us to fight biphobia, stereotypes, and erasure as much as traditional activism does. And my idea was to make monosexual people play the role of the bi+ person. I wanted as many people as possible to empathize with Cree, so I create a main character which also moves through reality, but is also presented as a real. So we have real on screen, so that it mimics the meta level of these other types of parasocial relationship that we already have. Or that many teens, at least in my head, they have nowadays with social media. And I played a lot with the identification of the public. The character can be seen as hetero till a certain point of the story, and then the gaze changes. Same with gender. Till the scene of the first period, the biologistic gaze of the teens doesn't get activated at all, and everyone sees simply themselves. And I know this from feedbacks because teens are pretty direct and evil, and I had the privilege to talk with them after the play. So Cree is a bit every one of us, but in the middle of the play, the word bisexual comes out for staying, because we should not allow ambiguity and always vocalize self-labeling. I show sapphic desire in a friend to lovers dynamics, and I talk about ex-crushes with a certain Andrei who ghosted them. The necessity of creating a past to explain bisexuality was something that I wanted to avoid, because I know it's also a trope in narratology that you use bisexuality to create like a conflict, but it's also true that I was writing with a form of pedagogically, and I couldn't make it like overcomplicate, so I had to create this sort of binary of gender of the past and the present. And good characters in theater have to have a past. So another thing that helped me describing B+ experience was also to describe what Cree finds attractive, not who. Like, for instance, there's this scene where there's description of the ants that for some people, they couldn't really understand what was about, but I thought it was really like not focusing on the identity in the relationship, but on the what. And in the apparently dichotomic choice, and very binary again, of utopia or reproduction of biphobia, I decided to create a compromise. So the play is not completely utopic, but the main character has 0 internalized biphobia, which is quite unrealistic, but it works well in a play for teens where you can still give a shape of reality. I only reproduced the "it's only a phase" sentence, but I put it in a context where it is clear where it comes from a person who really had a phase. I find the sentence biphobic in a certain context, but I also think that a part of the queer community had the phase experience because of homophobia, and it has to be addressed too. Coming from a same-age lesbian, it does not have the same energy as coming from a hetero person. Then I asked myself, which role can class play in a queer coming of age? Why do I use the double metaphor? Why is intersectional the way that I thought about bisexuality and non-binary character? In all the plays that I've written so far, I analyzed the intersection between class dynamics and queerness because I honestly don't see enough discourse about it. And in the play, Chris' mother, she's alone with 2 kids. She's a first-generation migrant who works most of the time, and she embodies a specific discourse. She's quite cringy, and the relationship with Cree is challenging, but not because of the queerness. There is a conflict because Cree feels they have to babysit their young sister all the time, and only at the end will Cree understand that it is because of class and not because of the choice of their mother that they're asking for it. As I said, queerness is never a problem, but their mom has no idea what a bisexual is. I didn't want to create a perfect neoliberal Netflix parent, but I wanted to show how not being into certain discourses and not being politically correct does not mean being queerphobic. So the mother has a boomer humor, I can call it, when she makes almost transphobic jokes, Cree corrects her and she apologizes. So this should work, in my opinion, in a pedagogical way. Homophobic parents are mentioned, but they are never on stage because I didn't want to reproduce it. And their homophobia is also never associated to their class because that's not a problematic in classist narratology. What does it mean for me as an Italian immigrant to write about queerness in Germany for the new generations? I think it was one of the hardest things to do, to accept that I had no idea what kind of public I will have, because Berlin is multicultural, mostly white, class mixed society. My public was a specific public because it's a public that usually has been forced by schools to see that. So there is like an automatic resistance to that. And they would be at least 15 years younger than me. So I was afraid I was a bit too behind in empowerment discourses, like thank you, internet, for helping the queers now, but I didn't have that. So I thought like, I was very afraid, but actually from feedbacks afterwards, it depends on so many different things. And I was not like more behind of them or less behind. There were different types of discourses and many different cultures also involved in the perception. The only role model that I had for my narrative was the cartoon The Owl Owls. I don't know how many of you know that. And exactly like The Owl Owls and other pop cultural products, sex education, actually, like Amsterdam was also for an adult B+ public who was raised during the whole teenage years. So we also had more comment coming from the adult people bringing their kids to the play. As I said, it was not easy. So here are some warnings. I also have a trigger warning for biphobia. So the problems. Since I never written with a queer pedagogical agenda, and I've never studied pedagogy, I decided to ask for help. The tutor helped me to organize an appointment with an institution with queer pedagogy experts. And those experts directly assumed that I was appropriating a story which was not mine, we met online, and this was automatically like reading myself in a certain manner. And then they told me also like a young non-binary person would never say bisexual, but pansexual, although my questions were different ones. So I wrote quite autobiographically on the queer storyline, and it was very problematic to hear that. The person told me that, of course, because bisexual is binary. I honestly am still struggling with the difference between gender and sexuality in my personal experience. I came out as bisexual 10 years ago, more or less, and for me it has always been a gender thing too. So now I started to use the term NB, but for me the experience is only one. While writing the play, I healed also myself and realized that there was a bit of a gender euphoria in my biography, which did not represent every bisexual experience. But in the exact moment when I was discovering it, I got raised and corrected. So I am afraid that queer institutions are still full of misconception about bisexuality. And I also don't know if it's more in Germany but it has happened a lot in Germany that I get the correction with pan, and they don't understand that B+ is like the umbrella term. I also got very counterintuitive and like feedbacks at university from monosexual people because we had like feedback sessions, and it was quite funny because some of the public or like the people reading the play, they would read that also as a trans play. They would say, it's a trans play. Oh, I see also trans codes and the colors. Oh, you put the colors because there's the non-binary flag. And also if the codes actually were not there from the people who had made the concept of the scenery. But on the other side, it was seen as a transphobic play because it would use the term bisexual. So I had both of them at the same time criticizing, plus accusation of cultural appropriation, and that would come only from the people that would know me personally, because I have the primary community, the theatrical community right now. So they thought like, oh, you're writing lesbian story, although it was a mixed relationship story and really bi. What really helped me for this was inviting B+ activists and people to join the public, because the type of feedback that I would get would be very, very different. Unfortunately, I didn't know any underage B+ person. Networking, visibility. So also if people couldn't come, they would send the link, and I know that I would get just like support, like thank you that you did it. And the commentary on the guest book, and this really a bit connects also to what Caroline said, because I got this comment, where were you when I was 12? And like to read this is something that makes sense to get all the shit from people who have no idea of what biculture is. Also, Amsterdam just won the fundings from Perform Europe and will stage in Luxembourg and Liechtenstein as a relaxed performance with audio description, making bisexuality more accessible than ever. So after putting the play on stage, I discovered there is a guide, free online. I don't know if you know about that. You can download it for free. The group is called Rewrite the B-Line. And there you can really check your characters if they are well-written bi+ identities. To be honest, if you're bi, I think you automatically fulfill 90% of the requirements. But it is the best tool so far that I have found online for sensitivity reading on this topic, and can be very useful also like to send to other people if we notice that the representation is not the best. It works very well for cinema, but I think it can also be used for drama. For drama, the different thing of drama is that there are even more level of interpretation from the text till what the public sees, till what happens on stage. It has more risky moments of misinterpretation, I think. And also the narrative is shorter usually. So it works on something, but also on other points should be like more adapted for drama. And this is the end of my presentation. I also wrote self-care because sometimes we forget how, like, also just reading some B literature can help overcome very annoying eraser situation while trying to do activism. And feel free to contact me if you need support, if you're doing something similar. I can write on WhatsApp and say you're doing a good job. And if you want to collaborate, I'm really looking for collaboration with other B+ writers, and we can do it in English, Italian, German, or also Spanish. And thank you for listening to me. I'm going to put the contact again here, if anybody is interested. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was wonderful. It was a really good way to end off this panel. So we have a couple of questions in the chat and about 3 minutes left. So I'll try to get to a couple of them as much as possible. The first one was directed towards Camille, who wanted to know, and the person Theo wanted to know, are there laws to protect LGBT people from discrimination in Japan? Just as like a clarifying question.
Not really. There aren't many laws that protect LGBTQI plus people specifically, because there isn't the main component of active violence towards LGBTQI plus people. So Japan is mostly seen as a safe country for queer people because there is, the lack of active violence, but the government doesn't really take that we should give them rights situation seriously. So at the moment, there is a big push for same gender marriage to pass as a law, at least for that. And there are some arrangements made locally to have lists of couples that can have benefits, but it's a local situation. So if your city doesn't have that list available, then you don't have some basic rights in that sense. So there is no large scale, but it is on the table as a question at the moment. So it is talked about at least.
Thank you, Camille. And we have one more question to end off the panel because we only have about a minute left. So it's going to be towards Alice. And if anybody else has any questions that we didn't have the chance to get to or that they maybe think of later, feel free to email our presenters after the fact. So question for Alice from Ross. Do you feel pressure to get everything right? How do you keep going amidst this pressure?
I cry in the corner. No, yes, I was like, I had to understand what was the thing that was making me self-unsure, like, because maybe I also don't like what I'm writing, or like there is something that doesn't correspond to what I actually want to convey, because that's basic writing problem, like when you have an audience or readers. But on the other side, I had to deal with this pressure and understand if the pressure was biphobic or not, because at some point I was also like, oh, maybe I shouldn't write a non-binary character, and just making that in my head. So I had to read a lot of things, and then what really helped me was B+ people, to talk with them, because I knew that in the room it wouldn't make any sense to address this pressure because they don't know. So even if I explain, and also there were other B+ people in the room, but they didn't say anything, for instance, when it happened. So I think the wisest thing to do is like to understand in which context it makes sense to speak, and which other it just like, okay, I just need to ignore them and then do some self-care home. Yeah. I hope it answered the question.
Thank you so much again to all of our wonderful panelists. You all contributed to making this event really, really great.